everyone. My name is Kristi Bartlett. I'm so excited to be here speaking to you tonight. I think I know a lot of you who are here, but there's many of you that I don't know. So if you wouldn't mind just like typing in the chat where you're joining from, so we can see where we all are. I know some people are far away, so that would be great to just hear from you where you are. You can just keep that going as we get started. So the title of my talk today is Why Diverse Perspectives Matter in Healthcare Design. And I am coming to you not as an expert on this topic. I really consider myself a continual learner. So I am not trying to say I know all about all these things, but I hope that I can share with you some of the stuff that I've learned through my experience so far in the medical device industry. And then if you hear things in my talk tonight that you want to hear more about, I am happy to point you to resources to help you dig deeper and we can learn more together. So hold on, sorry, my slides. Okay, there we go. So a little bit about me. I am, like I said, I'm a continual learner. So I'm currently a PhD student, but I started my college education at Rice University in Houston. And then I studied at University of Houston, which is where I know many of you from and where I studied industrial design. And then now I'm currently studying at Purdue University. So at Purdue University, I'm studying a PhD in technology, which is kind of more of an overarching topic that would incorporate industrial design. Purdue University is located in Indiana, and if you've never been to Indiana, it kind of looks like this. Near where I live, there's a lot of corn, there's some windmills. So that's a little bit, you can imagine where I'm living right now. So while I have a master's in industrial design, at this point, I think labeling myself as specifically an industrial designer would be a little bit too narrow. I consider myself to be more of an interdisciplinary designer who does a little bit of engineering, a little bit of industrial design, a little bit of interaction design, UX design, web design, graphic design, etc. So I really do have an interest in design, and I really do have an interest in the medical industry. And that specifically is what led me to pursue a master's in industrial design and then to continue on in technology. But I wasn't always interested in healthcare. My dad has worked in healthcare for my whole life, and I think he always kind of pushed me in that direction a little bit. So I think in his mind, he wanted me to be a radiologist. So if you don't know what a radiologist is, it's the doctors that look at x-rays. And I think the reason he thought it would be good for me to be a radiologist is because they get paid a lot of money and they don't have quite as demanding hours as other doctors. So at some point during high school, I shadowed one of my dad's colleagues who was a radiologist. So I followed this radiologist around during her workday, and she was very nice, but the career really just didn't connect with me, partly because I had to assist this doctor in moving a patient onto the exam table. And at that time, like, I really hated touching other people, and I was not like a touchy-feely type of person. And I also was kind of afraid of people who were ill or unwell or just seemed like different. I was not into it. So even when I did enter college and I decided to study engineering, I didn't even decide to do bioengineering because, again, I was like, medical things are not for me. So I ended up doing my undergraduate education in civil engineering. And being based in Houston with a degree in civil engineering, most of the career options I saw were in oil and gas. Here's a bridge for civil engineering, but a lot of Houston civil engineers end up into oil and gas. And that did not connect with me either. So instead of doing that, I decided to basically leave engineering and work for a nonprofit. And so I did that for a few years until I had a really life-changing experience. And that was in 2014. So a few years after I graduated with my engineering degree, I became the primary person who was responsible for taking care of a family member who had very serious medical issues. And so I'm not talking a lot about this family member in order to protect their privacy, but I just want to share my own experience as I kind of was thrust into this medical arena, which again wasn't my first choice. I was not someone who was interested in medical things at the time, but suddenly I was in a position of having to learn how to use all this medical equipment to take care of this person. So while the family member was in the hospital, I would be there too, sleeping in the hospital room, being trained by the nurses to use all the equipment so that when the family member was at home, I would be able to use the equipment at home and take care of them. And a couple things immediately stood out to me when I took these things home. First and foremost was the usability of the equipment. A lot of it was clearly not designed to be used at home, and it was not designed to be used by a single individual. Most of it was designed for a hospital context where a team of nurses might use it together. So maybe you have 4 hands to work the equipment instead of 2. Also, a lot of the equipment did not look nice, and these were not things that I wanted in my home. So this experience became my motivation to go to school and study industrial design. And I did a master's degree because I wanted to build on my undergraduate experience in engineering, but I wanted to focus more on the human and emotional side of design. I think someone might need to be muted. So if everyone could just mute. Hold on.
Yeah,
Can you hear me now?
Thanks,
sorry.
Kristi. Yeah.
Okay, no problem. Sorry for that interruption. Okay, so like I said, I wanted to build on my undergraduate education in engineering, and I wanted to focus more on the human and emotional side of design. So I came to school to study industrial design, but I also came to school because I wanted to understand, why is all this medical equipment so terrible? And why is it that designers didn't seem to be focusing their energy into the medical field with the same energy that we see bringing to design in other realms? So for example, I thought about my iPhone. Like, I had probably gotten an iPhone sort of recently at that time, thinking like, wow, people put so much effort into making this a really good experience, but why aren't people putting this effort toward medical equipment when this equipment is things that oftentimes people's lives depend on? So that didn't seem right to me. So what I realized later was that maybe my question was misguided. Maybe people do not need to be professional designers to solve problems, especially in the medical area. There are actually a lot of very talented, creative people in the world who we don't call them designers because they don't have training as designers, but they're actually designers, right? Like, there's no certification to be a designer or not. Anyone can be a designer. So I saw this actually as I was using this type of equipment, which is a feeding pump that helps people who can't eat orally, but they feed through a tube that either goes through their nose or through their stomach. I saw on Facebook and Facebook groups like the amazing solutions that people came up with because they didn't like this equipment. It wasn't meeting their needs. So they were using this equipment at home. And I'm going to show you some of those examples right now, what these creative designers did to solve the solutions. So you can see here, some people went for the emotional angle and they made something that was more cheerful and bringing more joy into their day. Or they took a backpack that looked more appropriate for a child instead of a plain black backpack. Or they used like I guess that's like a toilet paper bar or something, like to hook the stuff to the wall so they didn't need the IV pole. Or this person on the far right, they used like a baby mobile and broke it apart and used that to hang the IV pole. Then people made all sorts of wheeled devices that their children could push around instead of an IV pole. I really like the one in the middle where they used like the base of a swivel chair. It's just incredible, like the things that people came up with, basically all these hacks to solve the problems that they were finding. Then there were some that were tiny that they kind of made with PVC pipes from the hardware store, or like the one in the middle, that's actually like a banana hanger from a kitchen and they hung it on there. So, okay, I won't proceed there yet, but basically what that showed me, and there's countless examples, like in this case, most of these users are probably parents of disabled children who are creating good solutions, but I also want to point out that many disabled adults create their own solutions as well. That's not the example that I'm showing right now, but absolutely that happens all the time, because either disabled people or caregivers will notice immediately when the solution's not working for them, when the like formally manufactured and sold equipment isn't good for them, then they'll make something else that meets their needs. And they might cast aside a device that doesn't work for them. So this next picture is an example of a device, and I read a case study about this device. So in the case study, this device is used by cystic fibrosis patients. It's like a breathing treatment device. So this case study was basically about the usability of this device. So the researchers, they found a bunch of adolescent users who were supposed to be using this device. And they asked them like, hey, how's this going for you, essentially? And the users really didn't like it. Like they said it was really time consuming to use, it was hard to use, and they really didn't like how it looked. And they said, I would never feel comfortable using this in front of my friends. I would not feel comfortable like taking this out in public. Like, I don't like this. So basically this case study concluded that the end users, they will quickly discard devices that do not fulfill their own expectations and their own needs, even when the manufacturers and the healthcare professionals consider that the user requirements were met with the product. So I read another study which said they found that only 1 in 11 medical device manufacturers were actually engaging users in their design processes. So I think it's interesting, especially since many in this meeting are industrial design students, and especially in the context of University of Houston, I think people are really taught, oh, you know, you need to do user-centered design, or you need to actually engage users in the design process. But unfortunately, in the real world and in the medical device industry especially, that often doesn't happen. So we're going to talk a little bit about why that is. One reason is because it's common for medical devices to migrate from one setting to another. So they might migrate from the ICU to like a lower level of care place, like an outpatient clinic, and then it might migrate to a patient's home. So that's basically saying this design that was originally made for one setting is then sold into a different market, but the design has not changed. So now we're stuck with, you know, something that was designed for one group of people who has a much different mentality and just a different environment around them. And now it's being given to another person. The migration can also occur on this patient spectrum. So from pediatric patients, like basically from adults to pediatric patients, which again might not be appropriate. Another issue is the complexity of the healthcare system. So it's often not a direct to consumer sale. So sometimes people kind of ignore the end users, like the manufacturers and the companies might ignore the end users because they're not the first line of marketing of who's going to be purchasing the product. So for example, maybe the doctor will be writing a prescription that then is getting sent to a durable medical equipment company and is getting paid for by the insurance company. But then the patient or the user is the one that's actually receiving the product in the end and having to use it. But there was a long chain of what happened before I got to that person. So what happens in this case is that manufacturers of medical devices, or like medical device companies, when they're designing, they will rely on basically the advice from people who they consider to be experts or thought leaders. So often these are like accomplished physicians or surgeons, and these people are thought to have like the most, basically they're thought to have this overarching view that they understand the patient's needs, even though they don't. Like they have a much different mentality and mindset than the patient, and very different needs. And you know, they're seeing the patients in clinic for a few minutes. They have no idea what the patient's home life is like. Another thing that happens is when these medical device manufacturers rely on thought leaders, the thought leaders in this case tend to be similar to each other. So surgeons and hospital executives and engineers and designers all tend to be male or men, and that is also not representative of who the end users will be. because disabled users obviously are all genders. Nurses are predominantly female, and at-home caregivers are also predominantly female. And a lot of times these are the people, either disabled users caring for themselves or nurses and at-home caregivers helping a disabled person. That is not the same group at all as the thought leaders that are being consulted. So even this can be seen in surgical tools. One survey of surgeons found that 50% of surgical instruments felt too large to grip comfortably. And this was for all surgeons. But for people with particularly small hands, 80 to 90% of the instruments were uncomfortable for their hands. And we all know that women tend to have smaller size hands than men. So a 5th percentile female hand is much smaller than a 95th percentile male hand. And women also tend to have less grip strength. So surgical tools that are designed around male hands may make it really difficult for people with smaller hands or for women to feel confident using the tools or feel like the tools are really achieving the job. So this is a really big problem. And some people might say, oh, well, since most surgeons are men, it makes sense to design the surgical tools for men. But that's really backwards thinking. I think like design, in a way, it can really even expand a user group. So one example I like to think about for that is the baby born baby carriers. Like these baby carriers, they did a really good job with their marketing and product placement, you know, placing it in this show and really making it seem like, hey, men should wear babies, even though baby wearing has traditionally been a role that mothers took on in many cultures. But they really kind of rebranded baby wearing into something that was for everyone. And I think we can, so basically I'm saying it's a limiting mindset to think we should just design for the existing users. Really, you should design for non-users or anyone who may be able to become a user. So this issue of not including the end users in the design strategies can also be seen in other areas besides just medical devices. It can also be seen in more connected devices and wearable technology. So another study I read said that only 10% of studies were using participatory design strategies when they were developing wearable technology for autism intervention. So most of the studies did not actually engage with autistic adults at all. So they basically designed solutions through their own mindset, which were in many cases trying to like cure something that many autistic people would not agree is even a problem. So this brings us to this idea of the medical model of disability versus the social model of disability. So this little cartoon, I'll just describe it in case you can't see it. It's a person sitting in a wheelchair at the bottom of some stairs, and there's a sign that says, "Weigh in, everyone welcome." And obviously they say that they're being welcoming, but really they are not, because the only way to go in is up the stairs. So the medical model of disability would view this, that the person's impairment is the problem. Like if only we could help, we could cure or fix this person. We could give them, you know, maybe robotic exoskeleton legs so that they can walk up the stairs, or give her prosthetics or something. Then the social model of disability completely flips the perspective around and says, you know, the stairs are the problem. We should build a ramp. We should redesign our building or our environment or our devices or whatever it is to include everyone regardless of their needs. And we don't need to try to change these people. We can change our perception, or we can change our environment. So this brings us to the topic of ableism, and ableism is discrimination and prejudice against people with disabilities. So ableism really sees non-disabled as the default. And, you know, if you're disabled, like, oh, sorry, you don't fit in the majority, like we can't please everybody, right? That's that attitude. Ableism is really closely linked with ageism, and ageism is discriminatory practices against older people, or practices and policies that perpetuate stereotypes about older people. And you can see that there's this relationship here, because sometimes ageism is rooted in kind of like a fear of death or a fear of disability, a fear of dependence. So when we design for older adults, I think we need to ask ourselves, are we seeing them through an ageist lens and kind of assuming like that they're very different from us? And I think you see this in design for disability and design for aging. Sometimes people assume like, oh, well, if somebody's old or somebody's disabled, they don't care what things look like. They don't care about design. Like, I'm cool and hip and fashionable, but an older person or a disabled person would never be like that. Like, they just need something that's purely functional. When in reality, we all know, like, there are unfashionable nerds who are young and able-bodied, and there are people of all ages and types and lifestyles who care about how things look, who want to present themselves in a way that makes them feel good. So here's an example. And I think when you see this product, you probably know what it is. It's like a chair to go inside of a shower. And somebody might use this if they needed, for some reason, for whatever reason, to be sitting down in the shower. But if you're imagining who would be using this chair, you're probably thinking of somebody who is maybe very old or very feeble or very disabled. But in reality, it could be anyone. So this person, Carson Tuller, is somebody that I follow online. And I noticed one day that he was doing this sponsored ad for CVS. And the thing next to him is the shower chair that CVS was now selling, which looks so different than the previous shower chair. And I really don't think that he would have been doing a sponsored ad for the previous shower chair because it doesn't match his taste. It doesn't match his home. So in this ad, you're not going to read the whole ad, but basically he's saying that he felt like these products, this line of products at CVS was really good because it looked like something that he would want in his house and that he would like to use. So something that I think is interesting about disability specifically is that any of us can, and many of us will, become disabled later in our lives if we're not already disabled. So one example of this was the very famous architect Michael Graves, who became paralyzed, I believe, in 2003. After he had already had quite a long career as an architect, he was already a renowned architect. He became paralyzed from the waist down. And after becoming paralyzed, he had an awakening that all of these spaces and products were not centered to the needs of disabled users. And so then he spent the rest of his career working on that. So the shower chair that we just saw in the previous ad was the work of his studio. And also this patient transport chair here, which is like a wheelchair, but that's used in the hospital to push people around, was also the work of his studio. And I think he just really thought, we can make these products beautiful, which is obvious, but a lot of people just aren't doing it. So I've spent the last few years working at a startup that's focused on fall prevention. And I don't know if you guys have all seen these ads, like they used to be on TV commercials a lot when I was a kid. This "I've fallen and I can't get up" ad that just really like, basically that's one solution for falls, right? Is once somebody falls, try to get them some help. So we really took a different approach in the company that I'm working with, and we took a product. I'm not on that yet. So here's another solution, which I've seen online, but for some reason I've never seen anyone wearing them. This is another fall solution, which is an airbag belt. So this is a belt that has like a fall detection sensor inside it. So once you start falling, it will release airbags around the hips to try to prevent hip fractures in older adults. So there's one airbag belt. And here is another airbag belt, which I think is photoshopped onto that man. I don't think that man's actually wearing the airbag belt. But one thing that I think is interesting is, like, I know that I've never seen anyone wearing these belts. If any of you have, please let me know. I've never seen anyone wearing these belts. I've also seen sometimes the people who are running these companies are younger and are maybe making some assumptions that people will want to wear these belts. Another weird thing about the belts is, like, there's no belt loops and it cannot even hold up your pants, actually, which I think is very strange. Like, at least they could have maybe made it a dual purpose thing that actually would be, you still have to wear a belt basically under this belt. So it's very strange. So I was excited to work with this company that I'm working with now, where we tried to take a completely different approach to fall prevention. And instead of just kind of trying to mitigate the effects of a fall, we try to prevent falls by creating a fall risk assessment that anybody can own and use at home. Because actually, once you notice that you have a problem with your balance, you can take action to improve it. So for example, people could go to physical therapy, they could work with a personal trainer. There's many things that people could do or talk to their doctor to try to improve their balance if they have a balance problem before they fall. So what our device is it's a scale, essentially. Looks like a typical bathroom scale. And we did that on purpose. We tried to make it look like a typical health and wellness product rather than a device that's like for aging or for older adults. Because we noticed that a lot of older adults wanted to own the same products that we did. One day during one of our research studies, I was speaking with an older man who was participating, and he was showing me his new Apple Watch that he had just gotten. And he really liked the Apple Watch. And he showed me all the features. Like he said, you know, if I do fall, I can use it to call my son. The same way that fall alert, like I've fallen and I can't get up, you can do the same thing with the Apple Watch. But then he also said, you know what else? Look. And he pushed the button and like pinged his phone. Like he threw his phone across the room and he pinged it. He was like, it helps me find my phone. It did all these things that were really useful in his life. And he liked how it looked and it made him feel confident. So we realized that just because we're designing something for older adults doesn't mean that it has to look like a stereotypical kind of older adult product, which a lot of them don't look good, as we just saw. Okay, now we're going to shift gears completely, but we're not completely shifting gears because we're in the same theme of not really connecting with users and not understanding the actual needs of people. So I'm going to introduce this topic and then I'm going to show more examples that'll make clear why I'm introducing this topic. So critical race theory, this is a super summarized definition. There's many tenets of critical race theory and it comes out of legal studies, which is absolutely not my area. But some of the application can be applied to healthcare design too. So critical race theory says that race is a socially constructed category, not a biological category, and it's used to oppress people of color, and that racism is a normalized and institutionalized feature of American society. So one example that you may have seen, I'm not going to play this video, this is just a screenshot, but you can look it up if you want to. Basically what happens in the video is this black guy tries to use the soap dispenser and it won't dispense any soap. It's an automatic soap dispenser. Then his white friend comes, puts his hand under it, and immediately dispenses soap. Then the black guy tries again and again, and it doesn't dispense any soap. But then he grabs a white paper towel from right next to it, holds that under, and immediately soap comes out. So basically the sensors were calibrated only for light colors to hold it, to dispense the soap. And you might think, okay, whatever, it's a soap dispenser. He could use a paper towel. But there's many more serious things than soap dispensers that have basically racism built into them. Like we saw in the previous definition that racism is embedded in our society. It can also be embedded in our products. So another example, which I was really honestly surprised to find this out, but also not surprised, is that fitness trackers actually work better on light-skinned people and on people who are not overweight. So in individuals with higher BMI or darker skin, fitness trackers don't work as well. So this study that I read, these are the exact fitness trackers. I looked them up from the study. They found that the Apple Watch Series 5 worked 32% worse for people with higher BMI and darker skin. Fitbit Versa 2, which is on the far left, was 61.2% worse for people with darker skin who are overweight. And the Polar M600 was 32.9% worse. So again, we might be like, oh, fitness trackers, well, those are kind of just for fun, for fashion. But then there's also the problem that pulse oximetry works worse in Black patients. So the study that I read said that pulse oximetry, which measures the oxygen content in your blood and can diagnose if you're having an acute problem, works 3 times worse in Black patients than in white patients in terms of detecting a problem. So it's 3 times more likely to miss the problem in Black patients. And again, that this technology, this didn't have to be the way that we devised to diagnose this problem, the oxygen saturation, but that's what people designed. And think about why that would be. At least I've noticed in my being a PhD student, I work on research projects all the time. And I need to recruit people to test my designs or whatever. People generally are recruiting whoever else is around the office, like, hey, put this on your finger, let's see if it works on you. So if everyone in the room and everyone you decide to recruit is the same, then you're going to be missing a lot of data. And you're going to be having a really limited pool to draw from in terms of developing your technology. So another area that's often overlooked is failures in designing for people who menstruate. I'm sure we could, for any of these, there could be so much more examples. I'm just showing you a few that I've heard about recently. So one of them, which I think was quite humorous, was this thing called pinky gloves. So this product was developed by a company who thought that touching menstrual blood with bare hands was a problem, and therefore we need a solution to make it so people don't have to do that. So they sold these gloves that people who menstruate were supposed to use to remove their tampons, and then they could also wrap the tampon up in the glove and throw it in the trash. So this product, as you can see, it has problems on many levels. Number one, it stigmatizes touching menstrual blood. Most people I know have no problem taking out a tampon without gloves and then just wash their hands after because it's not that big of a deal. It also stereotypes people who menstruate as people who like pink. And number one, not all women like pink. Number two, not all people who menstruate are women. And number three, this particular shade of pink is basically always chosen by teams who are trying to design for women, but there's no women on the team. So now we will see the team that built this product. The two people on the outsides are the founders of the company, and the person in the middle was the investor. I believe they were in Germany, and yeah, there's some German behind them. They got so much criticism that they had to halt the release of their product. So again, we might be thinking, oh, whatever, that's some weird guys in Germany. But we would be wrong. They're not the only ones who have made mistakes in this area. When Apple first released their health kit, they basically released it with everything, seemingly everything but a period tracker, is what some people felt. So many women thought that that would be essential. And what I think is interesting, the reason I put this clip from the article, so they said, I shouldn't be surprised. Apple's first diversity report did show that the company is mostly white and male. So it's likely that menstrual cycles just aren't a concern for a majority of the company's employees, but that shouldn't be an excuse. Apple undoubtedly spoke to a number of physicians when it created its app. The company has boasted of its partnership with the Mayo Clinic. So I thought that was interesting, just going back to what we talked about before, okay, why would you talk to physicians to figure out the needs of regular everyday people? Why wouldn't you talk to a diverse group of people? Because we also know the physicians are not a very diverse group necessarily. So it shouldn't be surprising. The author of this article was surprised that physicians didn't center the needs of people who menstruate, but I personally wasn't very surprised if that was their research approach. Okay, so now we're getting to the part of the talk where we talk about what should we do? And something that I think a lot of designers are trained to do is to empathize. But there's also many articles that I've read, specifically coming out of the kind of critical disability studies community, that point out really the limits of these empathy exercises. So disability activists actually discourage things like empathy exercises that focus on like, put yourself in the position of the affected user. So for example, this picture, I think it looks like an empathy exercise. So this woman in the middle, she's kind of has like sunglasses on inside to simulate low vision. She's got a neck brace for some reason. She's like weighed down with all these braces and like ankle weights. And she's like basically doing this like immersive empathy exercise to simulate being a disabled person, or maybe like an older person. I don't know exactly what she's doing. But basically, disability activists discourage these things because basically these things just really center the designer, like the designer as the all-knowing savior who can figure everything out. Like, why wouldn't you, instead of doing this, just ask disabled people about their experiences? Because even if I were to go around in a wheelchair for a whole day, then I would really know what it's like to spend my first day in a wheelchair. And that would be nothing like somebody who has spent many years in a wheelchair and probably is very good at using a wheelchair and has figured out many workarounds that I wouldn't have figured out in one day. So basically, any design process involving disability should include centering the voices of disabled people. And then when disabled people do participate in the design process, they should be given credit for their work. So it's not okay to take their ideas without giving them credit, but they should be seen as equal partners in the design process. So disability activists also discourage things like hackathons that aren't co-led or led exclusively by disabled people, because again, it's kind of a bunch of people coming in and saying, oh, we can be saviors and fix all these problems. Like, how do you know you're even fixing problems that somebody wants to be fixed? You don't. There's no way that you would know that. So this is a quote from an article I read. Basically, they said, empathy exercises can present designing bodies as non-disabled bodies, and they position disabled bodies as non-designing bodies. So, okay, before I go to that, I also want to say that I think all of these things have illustrated, we didn't just talk about disability, even though I'm coming back to that, because ultimately, that's what medical design is about, essentially. It's about designing for bodies. It's about designing for people. And disability obviously takes many forms, so it can also be mental, and we didn't go into that as much. But I think we all know, probably everyone who's in this talk, that we need to support a more diverse community of designers. So that includes racially, gender, disability, age, all of these topics that we've covered. And we also didn't cover like any issues of sexual orientation, but that is also another area that needs to be more diverse in design. But also we need to understand that designers are not some kind of higher level of people who then always go around fixing the world's problems, but we can take a more humble position and work alongside other people or beneath them in order to work together to create new solutions. So finally, I have on the last slide a couple of resources of other groups that I think are doing a really good job to platform diverse groups of designers. So I hope that you will visit their websites and learn more about them. You can also always get in touch with me. These are 3 ways that you can get in touch with me if you want to, and if you want to talk more about any of these topics, I would be happy to do that. Or if you see, something that you want to do and there's a way that I can support you, just let me know. So that concludes my talk portion, but I know we also have a lot of time for questions. And I think, Mariana, do you want to be like the question moderator?
Yeah,
Okay.
no problem. Yeah, so Kristi, thank you so much. That was an awesome talk. But like she mentioned, we are open to questions. So if you would like to, drop it in the chat and we can get Kristi to answer your questions. There was a lot of content, so yeah. But you can also feel free to unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and then ask the question.
Hey, Kristi,
Okay.
excuse me.
Oh,
Sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
Would love to, great talk, first and foremost. I appreciate you sharing your experience as well as the research that you've done. My biggest question would be, how have y'all, especially being at ZIBRIO as well as, I guess, in your furthering of your studies, how have you included the people that you're designing for into the design process to be more inclusive? So you talked a lot about how people are doing it incorrectly. What are some of the ways that you guys are doing that you feel is beneficial?
That's a good question. Before I started working at the company, a lot of that stuff was done before I joined, but they did multiple focus groups with older adults to kind of get some of their impressions before we even really worked out the details of the product. So one example is we have like very large numbers on the scale, because one complaint that many of the people in the focus group said is that their bathroom scale had really small numbers and they had to like bend down in order to read the weight, which I don't know if you've tried to do that before. Like, at least on my scale, once you get off, the weight kind of goes away. So it would be pretty hard to do that. So that's one way. And then as we've done a lot of basically different community events, like we used to do a lot of kind of test demo events at community centers around Houston, which had a lot of older people there. So we were able to have a lot of conversations with them. And then we also were able to collaborate with AARP, which has been really awesome because they have not only a lot of focus group resources, but they even had like professional moderators that would do those focus groups for us. So that was really cool too, because AARP has amazing resources. Those are a couple of things. I'm sure there's more. Oh, another one is like we would test things on our own parents or grandparents. Also our founder, our co-founder, her dad was like, he was a retired electrical engineer and he was doing a lot of our engineering, and we worked really closely with him, all the time on the engineering, but also on other aspects of the product. So that was an easy way as well.
There's a question. There's a question from Leslie Cern. For people who want to advocate for disability in design, what would be good resources locally to learn about it?
Oh, that's a good question. It's hard for me to answer for like locally, because locally is everywhere. But I would think that personally, I would, rather than necessarily looking for things like disability and design, because it's so small. So I see Emily made a comment about the IDSA Design and Disability article series, which is amazing. So I know Emily has done an interview in there, and you should definitely read her interview, as well as Ariel. So there's a bunch of awesome disabled industrial designers who are working on kind of bringing more visibility to disabled designers, which is excellent. And I really am glad to support them however I can by doing a small link in here. I would definitely listen to them, the disabled designers, anywhere that you can find them. And also, you could find local groups that are just like disability advocacy groups, even if they don't have anything like overtly to say about design on their website or whatever. I think that understanding any disability advocacy issues in general would then show you better ways to advocate for disability in design, if that makes sense. So I would focus on listening to the voices of disabled people and then thinking about how that applies to design.
Hey, Kristi. It's Elliot. I just had a comment and a question.
Okay.
First of all, my comment is like, really, you do such a great job bringing, these topics to light, in your platforms. I know every time I look you up, I always see something that you're trying to tell, hey, people, kind of wake up to these things. And I just truly appreciate that. I also like this idea of you sort of in really showing us this idea of getting the designer out of that mentality of you're the savior of mankind, right? Which is, maybe I'm speaking for myself, but we all like to think ourselves that way sometimes, especially a little bit of confidence helps. But for the most part, we're servants, right? We're servants for people. And if we approach design that way, I think, it goes so far than just thinking like, I have the right answer every single time. And, no matter what anybody says in the room, I know that I'm right, sort of deal, right? Which I thought, we continually have to remind ourselves. But my question is, so, for students, obviously being tied to U of H and seeing a lot of students and being a student myself, what would you tell like a student that's a freshman, a sophomore, that's designing, their salt shaker, they're designing their chair, right? That's not a medical device, that's not a life-changing device. What can they do now in their studies to kind of help, reinforce those ideas so that when they do get to that position and they have the power and the opportunity to affect, they know what to do?
That's a good question. I think I would go back to the statistics that I shared about like how few people are actually implementing any kind of user-centered methods. So I know that U of H does a really good job teaching, or at least they did when I was there, teaching people how to do research. But I also know a lot of students, it's not necessarily their interest. So they might just, send a survey on Facebook with 15 typos to 6 of their friends. And that is not, that's not what is going to get the job done. So I think I would look for opportunities to really understand the needs of others in ways besides doing a survey. So another thing that is often not done is basically like another thing that happens in medical device design is that it can tend to be very technology driven. What I mean by that is that somebody will invent a new technology, or they'll think of a new application for the technology and then think like, oh, how can I sell this to people? So if an idea is technology driven, it's not really driven by a user need. So I would spend as much time as you can observing like the needs and the problems of the people around you. Because if you do that, you can even come up with something about the salt shaker. Like, I've seen that kids always tend to dump a ton of salt on their plate. So maybe you should invent a salt shaker that works better for kids. Like, I think there's opportunities in every project to do something really thoughtful and that's really driven by user needs. But that requires that you are always like thoughtful and alert to see, what around me is not meeting the needs of everyone. And I think that, University of Houston is an amazingly diverse school. And I think that there's a lot of people there with like really good insights about maybe what it is to be somebody who's not always designed for and who's not always centered. And I think that those insights could lead to really incredible projects.
Awesome. Thank you, Kristi.
Hi,
Well, thank you for sharing the link to your article, Emily. Everyone click in the chat and read Emily's article. Yes, Leslie.
Sorry. I just
No, you're good.
I have a question, but I don't really know how to phrase it as a question, if that makes sense. It's like you mentioned how lots of companies don't have the users test out the products, even though that's a necessary thing that you learn in design. The only company I could think of that kind of does that is like OXO, and it's like where do you see like this inclusivity evolving in the future to make companies realize that it's more necessary to do stuff like that?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that a lot of companies do leverage user insights, and I think it's especially in tech companies, right? Like especially in anything when it's a software, they're like always basically spying on the users to figure out what the users are doing to hook the users in even more. So there are a lot of companies that are really driven or focused on users. And I think that part of the reason for that is that software is like so flexible, because at least in my experience doing software design, can see like, you can ship the product, but then you can publish an update whenever you want, whenever you realize that something isn't working well for the users. And I don't know that like, it's more difficult for hardware companies to make changes on the fly, right? Because once you've made your molds or whatever for the plastics, like you invested tens of thousands of dollars into that finalized design. But I actually don't think that it's not necessarily as hard as people think, because you could take a prototype to a couple people's homes and have them test it. It's just really comes down to the commitment, I think. And I think there are companies, like you mentioned, OXO, that have that commitment. But I think a lot of companies just don't, because they don't necessarily see the value, or they don't know, they haven't done the thinking to think about what are the unmet needs. So I don't think it's necessarily as much of a resources problem as it is just a priorities problem, that they don't think it's necessary because of that mindset, like Elliot was just talking about before, of like, oh, I'm the designer, I already know everything. Why do I need to do that? I think I saw a hand up from Sarah.
Yeah, great. Hi. Wonderful talk. Thank you. I have a bit of a couple-pronged question here for you.
Okay.
So in terms of co-design or participatory design, how do you guard against convenience testing, and where do you like to source a diverse candidate pool? And in your practice, how do you heighten and advocate for the participants and give them credit as well as pay for their time, but also maintain their privacy should they choose that? What are your best practices?
Okay, I hope if I don't answer every part of it, just repeat the part that I didn't answer. Okay, so a lot of my own experience with participatory design has been more in the academic research side. And in the academic research side, it's a little bit different because, like for example, in my master's thesis project, I did a participatory design project, but I needed to protect the identity of the participants. So I was not able to use their names and give them credit in the way that I would have liked to, because they did not necessarily want to advertise the identity of their family and their disabled children, which totally makes sense. So I just had to say this project could not have been possible without these amazing families, but I wasn't able to, give their exact names. I think if I was collaborating with somebody who was fine with sharing their own name, then they could be credited. So in one paper I read recently, they recommended hey, instead of saying this was designed by IDEO, they should have said it was designed by IDEO and such and such, such and such, such and such, the disabled expert users that they were collaborating with. So I think it can come down to the credits as simply as that. In terms of compensation, I think, again, in my context, in my master's thesis, there was not compensation due to the fact that it was an unfunded project. But I think generally, people should be compensated for their time. So it's just, I would say if somebody's just testing something for you, then they could probably be compensated along the same lines that you might compensate someone for being in a focus group or a market research project, which, oftentimes people are given $100, $200 for giving an hour of their time for something like that. I think that's pretty standard. But then again, if somebody is really truly a participant in a co-designer, I think that there could be other avenues where they're compensated more, or they're credited with the design, or maybe they want to be more of an equal partner. And I think those possibilities are definitely out there and could be really good. Did that answer all the parts of your question, Sarah?
I'm also interested to know how you guard against convenience testing and where you like to source this diverse pool that you mentioned earlier.
Okay, that's a good question. I think that it's definitely hard to guard against convenience testing. I'm assuming by that you mean just like, oh, whoever you know. But if you maintain a diverse group of friends and colleagues, then the convenience testing may not be quite as much of a problem, right? If you have a diverse network around you. I have also done things where I like ask somebody, do you know anybody else? That's called snowball sampling. You know, you ask one person, you recruit the people that you know, and then you ask them who else do they know, because that expands the network a lot. I've also done recruiting for specifically like disability related surveys through Facebook groups, because there's a lot of Facebook groups that are centered around a specific disability, and people on Facebook come from all walks of life. So it's pretty easy to find like all sorts of different perspectives in there. So I think also disability organizations could be a good way, but I have not done that myself.
Thank you for answering.
Yeah.
Kristi, so I kind of have a follow-up question from the last bit when you were mentioning Facebook groups, because I want to know, how often did you get like a pushback of like, oh, you shouldn't be in our group, or, you know, we don't want you here?
That's a good question. I think when I've done that, I always asked the moderators first if it would be okay to post like a link to my survey or my inquiry in the group. I think also it helps if you have some reason that you're connected with it. So it's possible that they might be suspicious if you're like, hey, I'm representing such and such company. But I think also if you show that your company like cares about the needs of the people in the group, and that you're trying to develop a product that better meets their needs, I think most people will be open to that. But definitely in any group, I would contact the moderators first before posting something.
Yeah, I asked because when I was doing research for something else, like sometimes you can't join a group until you like apply, and then some of their questions don't apply to you, and so you try to go around it.
I see. Oh, I see. Yeah. Yeah. Then maybe you could just message the like leader of the group, and maybe they'll post it for you if they don't want you to join. I think that could work too.
Thank you. Someone was just asking if there will be a recording, and yes, we will have this recording available and send it out after. Do we have any more questions?
Actually, hi, this is Sam Millen. I just thought I'd chime in for a moment. First, I missed the first part of the presentation, but the portion that I heard sounded great, and I just wanted to say thank you for putting this together. Also, there's just a couple of things that I wanted to just sort of elevate. So I've been working as an industrial designer for about 27 years. And sort of a unique project that I worked on a number of years ago, which maybe this will be funny, as a white male, I designed a mammography system. And so I went through the experience of actually getting a mammogram, you know, and as part of the design process. And so one of the things I wanted to say is that, of course, inclusive design is good design. You know, and that's sort of like a universal truth, I think. And I was reminded, somebody mentioned the OXO Good Grips. The folks who worked on the OXO Good Grips talk about how people come in and they say, this is the peak of the bell curve of the users, you know, for our product, and therefore we want to design for the peak. And you know, the folks at Smart Design said, we don't care about the peak. We are only interested in the bookends, because if we can design a solution that meets the bookends, the people in the middle will sort of take care of themselves. And depending on the product, that can be true, right? That's not also, that's not necessarily universal truth, but it is in many cases true. So a couple of things that stood out that I thought were great were things like the fact that the stairs are the problem and not the wheelchair or the person. But I guess if I were to put a question out there, I mean, I guess one of the challenges as a designer, we're not saviors, but we are enablers, and we are people who are uniquely in a position because of what we do and the skill sets that we do carry. We are uniquely able to connect dots and build models and do things that not everybody can do, and that gives us a participatory role. But one of the challenges I've found across 27 years is it's amazingly hard to move the needle in the C-suite of any corporation, even healthcare organizations that make products for people who have very specific abilities. It's very hard to teach within those organizations how to move off of the primary motivators of cost and timeline and efficiency. And so it shouldn't be, and it isn't more expensive. Design is free. It isn't more expensive to make something beautiful. It isn't more expensive to make something good or a different shape. But it is a challenge to, if you don't have somebody in the room who is differently abled, or you don't have somebody in the room who has a different hand size, we're only left with those compensatory or alternative methods of experience prototyping. And that can move the ball forward a little bit, but it doesn't do the whole thing. But I guess my question would be, what are some of the things that you would recommend for designers generally, who are often in that position of being in, we get the benefit of being in the room with these people who have, deep pockets, and they're making business decisions, and they're solving or proposing solutions to problems that in many cases are real problems. How do we create that elbow room or that space for bringing in that broader perspective or skill set or individual people?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, I think in the beginning part of my talk, which you said that you weren't here, we talked about some of the reasons why, especially in healthcare, some of the reasons why people are not interested in hearing other people's perspectives. And I think, to me, it's been very shocking as I've been more in the healthcare startup space, but I'll go to events where company after company gives their pitch and their presentation, and the word patience is never mentioned, which is shocking because obviously the healthcare industry would completely disappear if there were no patients. So I think that's probably what I would do, is focus on the mission of the company and the reason for the existence of the company. If it's a healthcare company, I think vision casting is really valuable if done well. And leaders, especially it sounds like you're a leader, you've been in the industry for so long, leaders have the opportunity to articulate a vision and call other people to come into that vision and say hey, our company only exists because of patients. Let's put them at the center of what we're doing. For example, if it was a healthcare company, and kind of cast a vision of what could that mean for our company overall? What could that mean for our users and our network of people? I think that's what I would do. If I was somebody senior, I would be casting vision. If I was somebody junior, I would probably still be casting vision. But I think if somebody junior, maybe you give very much more practical suggestions hey, I have an idea, let's go test this at the community center. Just give a practical suggestion, because maybe nobody's doing it because nobody said it and they were being lazy or whatever. Because like you said, it's not expensive. Testing something at the community center is free, and it just takes a few hours of your time. So those are things that I would do. Another thing I noticed in the healthcare startup space, which was shocking, is on the stage. You know, they had this stage for people to come give their pitches. They built this whole facility, like in the Texas Medical Center. Oh, we're going to be the innovation center, blah, 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 blah. The stage had no ramp. So they never expected that somebody who used a wheelchair would go onto the stage. And eventually they did have a startup company where the founder was in a wheelchair and they had to take down the stage and put up a new stage. But they didn't have the foresight to even think like, these are the people that are going to come be here. And so I think, again, the leadership not having vision. And I think we all, as we grow up in our careers, can be better leaders with a better vision.
There was a joke about why IDEO is still in business and still teaching about user-centered design, and it's because people still don't get it. You know, talking about the user is not talking to the user. So talking about users in a conference room is not user-centered design. And so, but it's one of these things. It's you know, as with the joke about IDEO, you know, going out of business. If everybody got it, they'd be out of business, right? I mean, it's a persistent challenge, and it feels like it needs to be pushed at every level in every direction. Because just as an example, I actually work at a design firm that focuses exclusively on healthcare design, and it's frustrating as somebody who's, you know, independent of how many years I've been doing this, but you know, you get a project proposal that was written by somebody else, and there isn't space to talk to a user. And it's a healthcare design firm that only does this. And so that's why I ask these questions. Like, I'm always on the hunt for one of these sort of silver bullet techniques that you know, would enable us to, just do a better job. Because it's a challenge. Again, cost and timeline seem to drive a lot of decisions, and that was probably what drove people to build a stage without a ramp, because it was like, oh, we need to get this done quickly, and they didn't stop and really think about it.
Yeah.
But,
Awesome. Do we have any more questions? We might have time for like one more. Okay. All right. So yeah, I think that wraps up this session. Again, Kristi, thank you so much. It was such the things that you brought to light, and even like recent stuff, right, that you're saying you just found out about those devices, and it's like really shocking. And that part where you were saying about we're not saviors, but still in my, like, even today I told someone I want to, my future, or like in 5 years, I want to say like that I'm helping save the world, and it's like you have to kind of step down a little bit. But yeah, we really enjoyed your talk, and you were an awesome second speaker, and we would love to have you back as well. For all the participants, the people who came to watch, we will be having the recording and these links, we can share them as well. And yeah, so we'll send out the link where you can find all of this information. Thank you for joining us. It was a great time, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for coming. Again, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or whatever, and we can keep in touch.
All right, thanks. Bye.